Oh. All right, everybody. Welcome back to the Pat Flynn Show, or Philosophy for the People, depending on what channel you are watching this. We are joined once again by Dr. Gaven Kerr, and we're going to talk about Aquinas' philosophical approach to God. We're going to be using Gaven's excellent book, Aquinas' Way to God, as our little study guide here. If you don't have a copy of this book and you're interested in natural theology and metaphysics and just Thomism, this is essential reading. I know these academic books can be a little bit pricey. I get that, but sometimes it's worth it. And this book is definitely one of those that I think you need to add to your collection if you're serious about this. So, Gaven, welcome back. Always a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here. I know we've had some technical difficulties, and it seems the whole world is having technical difficulties at the minute on the internet. But we're here anyway, and sure, if people are seeing this, we've overcome those difficulties. So there you go.
Yeah, well, we were going to do the live stream and Q&A, but StreamYard is not working, so we're just kind of recording this. But we'll do another Q&A at some other point. There's plenty of material for us to discuss. So we're going to be going through Aquinas' De Ente. I really want to focus on one aspect or one key argument for the real distinction, because I feel like this does so much work for many different reasons. In fact, there is a time, Gaven, when I'd be curious just to get your thoughts, and we'll get warmed up here before we get into the argument. There was a time when I thought like this was the argument for God. And by that, I mean like the maybe only truly successful metaphysical demonstration. And maybe there's other pathways and get you started, but for them to be successful, they all ultimately sort of bleed into this pathway, right? Yeah. I guess I've broadened a little bit more. There's probably a few other arguments that I think are actually successful, even when you set a high bar. And then I think there's lots of other like considerations and evidences. I'd just be curious to get your thoughts on this. Is this the argument? Or?
So I mean, my thought is turned on that. I don't mean turned as in changed, but has really gone over that, for a number of years. The De Ente at Essentia has been with me since my first year of graduate studies in philosophy, because my master's dissertation, I did a master's by research. It was on the distinction of essence and existence in Aquinas. And I started doing that in 2004. So that's, when you think about it, 17 years ago, that's almost an adult. Nice. That amount of time passed on. So it's always something I've been turning over in my mind. And this proof of God was always just attractive. And whenever you read Whipple and his writings on the De Ente, he points out that this is a highly metaphysical proof of God's existence, and an extremely interesting one at that. And Whipple sort of always said, it'd be good if we had, a full-length study of that. And I thought the same. And then I wrote the book, not the ebook, but a book on it. And to answer your question, do I think this is the argument for God's existence? Well, yes, I do. I think this is Aquinas' way to God. Now, I didn't name the book Aquinas' Way to God because I thought that at the time. That was kind of a name that myself and, the people of Oxford that we came up with. But it was quite providential, because the more I've thought about this, the more I do think this is Aquinas' way to God. And the reason why I think it is Aquinas' way to God is because I think in all of Aquinas' proofs for God's existence, and if any listeners are interested in a systematic study of these proofs, there's one article which is out, whose name escapes me, but it's in a publication or a piece that I've written. And I name this article, and I can, send on details of that article, where the author goes through Aquinas' proofs of God's existence in chronological order. And I went and I looked at all of them. And it seems to me that in every single one of them, Aquinas is making a move from what is per aliuds or per accidens or per participationem. In other words, he's making a move from what is or from what exists through another to what is or what exists in itself. So it's a move from what is per aliud to what is per se, per accidens to the per se, per participationem to the per se. Now, the particular feature, which is per aliud, in all of Aquinas' proofs is different, but the form of reasoning is the same. So what is through another, say in the de ente proof, is the act of existence, esse. In the first way, it's motion. In the second way, it's causality. In the third way, it's necessity. The fourth way, it's actuality, degrees of perfection. The fifth way, it's finality. But it's always through another. So things which are per aluit, or per participation, and that are through participation, they have the participated characteristic in a derived sense. And that points towards what is per se, to what has the well, it doesn't have the characteristic, it is the characteristic itself. And so it is it per se. In the de ente, it's pure existence. In all of the five ways, it's pure actuality. And the way Aquinas justifies that is by appeal to the distinction between per se and per accidens ordered series, the denial of an infinite regress in per se ordered series, and the arrival at what's primary. Primary because it doesn't have the participated characteristic in any participated fashion, but is identical to it itself. Yeah. And I think the de ente, because it is a metaphysical argument, provides us with the form of argumentation, and then that form takes on different material instances in the different proofs that we find, such as you get in the five ways. So yes, I do think it is the argument for God's existence.
Right. Excellent. Yeah, that was a great summary. And by the way, beard's looking very strong, Gaven. Very impressed right now. Looks really solid.
I'm in an agreement with my very best friend. Not my wife, who is my best friend, but my other very best friend. We're not to shave our beards until Christmas time, just to see if we can get them long enough to put plaits in them like Vikings.
Nice. Awesome. Well, I look forward to seeing that development. So let me real quick, maybe just try to give the kindergarten version of everything you just said, because there was some, technical jargon in there, which we'll unpack as we move through the conversation. But yeah, the way I sort of think of the de ente is Aquinas sort of, he entertains a hypothetical of what would something be that sort of carried the reason for its existence intrinsic to itself? What would something be that existed in virtue of what it is, that exists through itself rather than through another? Yeah. And for reasons that we'll explore, he'll argue that it has to be uniquely unique. It would be one and primary, and it would have to be this way. Yeah. And then he'll carry that through and say, well, look, there's multiplicity of things, and wherever there's these multiplicity of things, it's clear that these things exist by way of participation. They don't carry existence with them, right? They receive existence. Existence is imparted to their essence, right? Now, he sort of starts it off as the hypothetical, right? But then, there's the various moves that are made, which we will get into, that will essentially say, well, look, if everything were the sort of thing that didn't sort of bring existence along with it, then like we wouldn't have anything existing at all. Like it'd be a big fat nothing, right? But that's that's a contradiction of fact, at least, right? There is something, so there actually has to be that thing that carries existence along with it. That thing would be a pure act of existence existing through itself, and then we'll run the conceptual analysis and see that it has the divine attributes. Now, I know that summary is probably not an exact close mapping onto the procedure Aquinas takes, but that's just kind of how I think of it in summary form. But maybe you could add your own thoughts there.
Yeah, so the proof of God in Aquinas' De Ente, it comes up in chapter 4, and it's a rigorously metaphysical argument. And the really cool thing is he sets out the metaphysics beforehand, which is awesome. So nobody can really say that Aquinas is presupposing all this different metaphysics. He lays it out everything that he presupposes. Right. So it's a presupposition, but it's justified presupposition because he gives argument for it. So anybody who takes issue with that needs to take issue with his argumentation. And I think that's an important...
Can we pause just real quick, Gaven? Because this is a really, I think, important point. And this was something that got brought up on a podcast I was doing fairly recently, of that, like the way the philosophical approach to God for Aquinas and let's say many of the thinkers in perennial philosophy is just very different than modern day philosophy of religion and apologetics, right? Yes. They're not out there just saying, what type of argument can I craft for God's existence today? Yeah. Right. Yeah. No, what they're doing is philosophy of nature and metaphysics, and they're trying to just carve reality at its joints, make sense of what is in front of them. And then as it happens, when you drive that through, it just, it winds up with God's existence on the scene and a very particular understanding and conception of God as well. So I don't know, I'm sure you have some thoughts on just the difference of method or procedure of then and now and why that's important to keep in mind.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's right. I think that the theists of the classical tradition aren't just thinking, right, here's a project, let's try to prove God's existence. Rather, they're thinking, here's a project, let's understand reality. So they're doing metaphysics. Say if they're philosophers, they do the philosophy of nature and then metaphysics on top of that. That would have been if they were in the arts faculty in Paris. If they were in the theology faculty, they would have been doing all of that plus the theology as well. So for them, it was about thinking through the nature of reality in a systematic way, or what we would say is a scientific way, and that involved demonstrating God's existence as the primary cause, just as much as demonstrating, say, the unicity of substantial form in an individual substance. Matter is the principle of individuation. High form can be multiplied to different kind of causes there are. The nature of final causality, causal series. All of that sort of really cool stuff that they do in metaphysics. It was all tied up together. So this was all part and parcel of the metaphysical project. Whereas now, I think there, whilst these arguments for God's existence make use of metaphysics, they refrain from engaging in a systematic metaphysics, one of whose issues is, demonstrating God's existence. Rather, what they're doing is they're just, getting on with the demonstration of God's existence, and, metaphysics will be a handy tool in doing that. Whereas, it was the other way around for people like Aquinas. What they were doing was metaphysics, and then God's existence comes in at some part and at some point. And, contemporary contributors to this discussion, they've pointed out that, when we're engaged with these issues, we can't just do, a load of hand waving, and dismissing those with whom we disagree. We have to do the hard task of thinking through their metaphysics critically. Rand Mullins, I'm reading his book here, for instance, The End of the Timeless God. And in the preface to that book, he's emphatic that we have to do the hard work of metaphysics, and I mean, he's absolutely right there. We do have to think through the metaphysics of those with whom we disagree or with whom we agree, and see that what they're doing is an overarching metaphysical project rather than just, jumping from one issue to another and trying to come to conclusions in it. Because if that's what you're doing, then any old argument will suffice. It won't be systematic. You won't be doing a summa of theology or a summa of philosophy or whatever. You'll just be, jumping from one conclusion to the other. And that's not, what these classical theists, these major thinkers were about.
Right. Yeah. Excellent. Okay, good. I just wanted to do some of that stage setting because it's just a point that I think is worth making up front, because sometimes people will object to Aquinas's way to God by essentially saying what you just said. It's like, oh, this supposes a whole metaphysical system. Well, it's like, yeah, that's true, but we think it's right. And I'll tell, like, just from my perspective, that's what attracted me to it. Right. Yeah. That's essentially why I'm a Thomist, right? Because I think that Thomists generally, but Aquinas especially, have rolled up their sleeves, done the metaphysics, and this leads to a conception of God that is extremely robust, and it offers an extremely satisfying explanatory scheme of reality, right? So I don't see that. I've never seen that as an objection, this sort of hand-waving dismissal of saying, well, that assumes a controversial metaphysics. Well, first off, in philosophy, like, what isn't controversial? Everything's controversial, right? But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely with that. One doesn't enter any proof of God's existence neutrally. And we Thomists, I say we Thomists, referring to myself, that's something positive. You don't enter the issue of God's existence neutrally because it comes up within metaphysics. When I, turned to Thomas's metaphysics, I didn't, think, right, I need to find a good proof for God's existence. I was, like, say, my master's, I was writing a thesis on distinction of essence and existence. And then I came upon the proof, but my concern was the metaphysics of essence and existence. And then, oh, look, here's a proof of God. So I got interested in that through the metaphysics. So for anybody to say that, let's say a Thomist, who's offering proof for the existence of God, is presupposing this metaphysics as if it's a bad thing. Well, Thomists in particular are well known for rolling up their sleeves and, getting in to the metaphysics of the matter, ad nauseam to some people, just too much metaphysics going on there. They'd prefer less metaphysics and more, arguing about God. But as the Thomist sees it, doing this metaphysics is part and parcel of getting a proof for God's existence. And right. One thing that the Thomist will never back down from is a kind of a metaphysical argument, or arguing about the metaphysical roots of any proof for right. God's existence. And I mean, the first 3 chapters of my book were just on the whole metaphysics that buttresses the whole thing.
Yeah, and I only see this as advantage, because if you do the hard metaphysical work up front, it actually saves you time later.
Yeah.
Right. If you just make a sort of haphazard argument for God, I think you're going to run into all sorts of coherence of theism issues that would otherwise have been resolved if you did good metaphysics first. You see what
Absolutely.
I'm saying?
And there's no ad hocery. When you do the metaphysics first, there's no ad hoc conclusions, assumptions, additions. There's just, the clarification of what's already there in the metaphysics itself. So you're drawn from this common well of metaphysics to establish God's existence, divine nature, creation, all the rest of it.
Yeah, beautiful. Okay, I'm glad we spent some time on that, because that was a really cool point. Let's return now to the De Ente. So if you can remember where you left off, maybe pick back up there. Yeah.
So so that was what was attractive about the De Ente proof, that you get it in its pure undistilled Scotch whiskey sort of form. It's single malt sort of proof for God's existence. That's what you got there in the De Ente, especially in the De Ente chapter 4. And Aquinas' strategy here, I mean, he's considering an issue about whether or not matter is the principle of individuation. The principle of potency. Not individuation, potency. Is matter the principle of potency, such that anything that has any potency, must it be material? Or is there another principle of potency? The theological context is angels, created separated substances. Are they material because, they're not pure actuality? But the more fundamental metaphysical point is that is anything which is immaterial pure actuality? Or is there some principle of potency which itself is immaterial, so it's not essentially tied up with matter? And Aquinas' solution to that issue is the distinction of essence and existence. Right. There were those who defended a view that there was a kind of incorporeal matter, that you could have non-bodily things, incorporeal things, but they still had some kind of spiritual matter, and so they did have some sort of potency. But Thomas goes the other route, and he argues that a thing's essence stands in potency to its active existence. So essence then is the principle of potency, and essence can be material or immaterial, but what's common to essence is that it stands in potency to the active existence. So if essence is the principle of potency, then existence is the principle of actuality. And that brings him right beyond Aristotle. He's into Neoplatonism now when he's into that, because for the Neoplatonists, they were trying to resolve the division between Aristotle and Plato on the forms. Mm-hmm. And what the Neoplatonists recognized, especially Plotinus, was that both Plato and Aristotle saw form as the most fundamental principle of actuality, of all reality. It was Plotinus and the Neoplatonists that saw that you have to have some principle beyond form, right, that even accounts for form. Now, Plato sort of saw that in the form of the good, and Plotinus goes with that, with the one. But this is a supra beyond form principle that accounts for even the reality of form. Well, for Aquinas, that's the active existence. And that accounts for the reality or the actuality even of form. Form now is relegated, to the level of essence, which stands in potency to existence. And it's in articulating this, how essence and existence can be distinct in things, that Thomas then brings us to the proof of God's existence. So he takes us through several stages of establishing that essence and existence are distinct. And then in what's seen to be the third stage of argumentation, he gives the proof for God's existence. So that's how things are laid out in the De Ente chapter 4.
Excellent. Good structure, right? So it's really just kind of interesting to see what the issue is that he's wrestling with here, and actually has it to do with angelology in a sense, right?
Yeah.
How do we, yeah. And so he's going there's a really rich development of thought here over and above just Aristotelianism, because it seems like form and matter, we're on board with that, but it seems like we need something else, right? We have to answer why are these forms here, but not all forms, right?
Yeah.
There has to be some other principle of actuality, and that's where the essence and existence distinction comes in, right?
Yeah.
Cool. All right. So I think we're good there. If people want to do more details on sort of the metaphysical windup, there's ton in your book. But let's get into the argumentation now, because there's yeah, where do you want to start? Do we want to start with the causal series, or do you want to start with actually trying to argue for the real distinction? What do you think is the best procedure here?
Yeah. Well, I know that, I mean, part of the interest, in some of this is that, there's been popular, sort of presentations of Thomism that focus on the first argument for real distinction. That's the intellectus essentiae stage. Now, I know that, you and I have talked about the intellectus essentiae stage, that, we can distinguish between essence and existence by distinguishing between the cognitional operations by which we recognize essence and existence. So it's one thing to understand the essence, another to understand the existence of the thing. So essence and existence must be distinct. And, that's the first stage of argumentation. And I know you and I have talked about that, and I've expressed dissatisfaction with that argument. Well, not dissatisfaction with the argument, but I've just said that I don't think Thomas intended the real distinction to be established there. I think all that Thomas intended to establish was that how we think about essence and how we think about existence are distinct, not that essence and existence are themselves distinct in things. And I know, I think you had Rob Coons on your show recently, who says that he wasn't too happy with that stage of argumentation.
Thomas seemed pretty divided on this, right? And I guess there's two questions you can ask here. One is, what did Thomas intend? And two, even if Thomas didn't intend to establish a real distinction there, have subsequent Thomists buffered the argument as to make it that the case, right? So I guess for the first question, I don't know. I probably just defer to your expertise on that. And to the second question, I actually probably lean more towards Oderberg, especially, and think that there are additional moves we can make with that form of argument to establish the real distinction. But for me, it isn't something that I'm like super settled on. I would just say that's the way I sort of lean on it. But I see those as two distinct questions, Yeah.
And I think that's right. They are two distinct questions. What did Thomas intend to establish, and what can that argument actually establish? And I think that's right. But I think maybe for our discussion this evening, maybe we could go into the second stage, because, we've discussed how I think this stage establishes real distinction, but I think there's not just in establishing real distinction of essence and existence. I think the second stage also establishes so much about God, or about this hypothetical being whose essence is its existence, such that if it were to exist, it would be all these things. Right. And so all that Thomas has to do is show that this exists in the next stage, and then everything that is shown in the prior stage follows.
Yeah, and this is one of those points where I said this key insight in Ente does so much work. It does, like, if this is a good argument, it does so much work, right? Because in contemporary philosophy of religion, we could say, like, what it does is it helps to bridge the gap problem that has kind of come up, which I think is a pseudo problem. But there's this idea of, like, okay, even if we grant that there's some sort of necessary reality, something that just its nature demands that it be included in the complete collection of everything real, how do we get from that to God? Well, the answer is this, what Aquinas is proposing here, right? And then we can kind of quickly move to unloading the divine attributes from that. So I just kind of like want to emphasize that how cool it is, right? How cool it is that this kind of feature of the De Ente, how much work it does. So I think you're right. I think it's worth focusing the conversation on this critical insight, because I think it's a good one. You think it's a good one, and if we're right about that, then this seems to solve a lot of metaphysical points of contention, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The only slight disagreement that I'll have with you there is that I will not use, the language of a necessary reality or a necessary being when talking about Thomas, about God.
I know you want. I know.
And that's something, having gone through every one of the proofs of God's existence, he very rarely arrives, at God, as this, sort of necessary being. It's only the proofs which have a family resemblance to the third way where he does that, which is one of the less sort of popular ways in his writings as a whole.
Yeah, so let's clarify that, because I think it's worthwhile, and you're right. So for Thomas, what we'll get to are pure actuality and stuff like that, and we don't argue to just like a necessary, most of the time anyways, to just a necessary being. Rather, necessity is what follows from or comes out of things like pure actuality, for example, right? That's what, right. And for Aquinas, and certainly his metaphysical system, there can be necessary beings that are still dependent beings.
Yes.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, so Aquinas' way to God is a causal way. What Thomas wants to establish is that God is a primary cause. And, I mean, I've argued this elsewhere in some forthcoming publications, that the science of demonstration and the science of demonstration about God, which say in the Summa Theologiae, question 2, article 2, just before he goes into the 5 ways, the kind of deductive demonstration Aquinas, seeks to offer about God, argues that we need to infer from creatures as effects to God as primary cause. That's the only way that we can do it. So it's not a modal argument. Even the 3rd way, where modality is introduced, it's still not an exclusively modal argument. It is a causal argument. It's not until Scotus that you get the more modalized kind of argumentation. So it is that what Thomas is striving after is to establish God as a primary cause of all, and that is our way to God, and that is how we understand God for Thomas, as a primary cause. And you're absolutely right. For Thomas, you can have necessary beings, which are creatures, and which can change. Thomas is absolutely clear about that you can have a necessary being which can change. I've been doing an awful lot of reading recently on eternity, immutability, that sort of stuff. And the amount of authors that say, for classical theists, immutability is bound up with necessity, such that, a necessary being is immutable and an immutable being is necessary. And it's like, well, no, angels are necessary for Thomas and they can change. The heavenly bodies, the planets, for Thomas, are necessary because they're fully actualized in their matter, yet they can change. They change place. Mutability, changeability, and necessity are not inconsistent for Thomas. So I don't see why, and maybe I'm sounding a wee bit impatient here. I don't see why people attribute to Thomas things which he explicitly denies, simply because, well, I don't know, that these would be the contemporary sort of modal notions that people would affirm. It seems to me that these people think, well, Thomas must have affirmed this if he had any sense, and so we will attribute this position to Thomas. And it's like, well, no, if you're going to attribute something to Thomas, at least find a text,
right,
where he says it, and don't say anything that he explicitly denies.
We must be fair to Thomas. We must always resist sort of importing our modern assumptions, modern philosophical assumptions back on Aquinas or any thinker of antiquity for that matter, right? We have to make sure that we're trying to understand them through their particular frame, reference point, however you want to put it. So no, I'm glad you pushed back on that, because that's an important distinction. And it's also just not hard to think of how there could be necessary realities apart from Thomas that are also still dependent realities, right? It's not hard to think of that being. So just because something is necessary, like it had to be included in reality. Well, I mean, like, for example, just hypothetical, and then we'll get back on point. Like imagine that modal collapse were true, right? And that the foundation of reality was a necessarily existent, purely actual being that just had to create everything. So everything else exists of necessity, but it still exists dependent on that foundation, right? So you have you have a whole bunch of necessary beings that are still dependent, right? Ontologically dependent. So it's not hard to think of things that could be necessary and still not, let's say, ultimate, right? Or primary or stuff like that.
Absolutely. And I mean, if anybody's read the 3rd way, the second half of the 3rd way, is that you can have these dependent necessary beings, and he runs the causal regress from that back to a cause of necessity for these dependent necessary beings. So how the attribution of the inconsistency of necessity and mutability was applied to Thomas, by various authors I've been reading, I just don't know. And I'm sorry to kind of, kick back on that, but I think it's important because, I mean, for me, I think the reason why I think Thomas was right is because of these issues that, I've done a careful reading of Thomas on these issues. And I see that he's, people who criticize him have either misrepresented him or just haven't understood him. And so when you kind of, get past the misrepresentations and do the hard work of thinking into what he was thinking, I think that, what he held was right and defensible. And so, which is why I'm going to, sort of insist on, an accurate portrayal of him if somebody wants to criticize him.
Good and fair. All right. So now turning to this, to the thing that we wanted to turn to in the Ente. Let's get it on the table.
So we're in the Ente chapter 4. 3 stages of argument. We've got this first stage of argument for real distinction. It's the intellectus essentiae stage. On my reading, that's Thomas just setting things up. He is establishing that essence and existence are distinct in our way of thinking about them. For others, Fieser, Oderberg, this is an internal Thomistic debate. Real distinction is established there. But then there's this second stage of argumentation, and this is the one I would like to focus on. The third stage is where he does the proof for God's existence proper. But this second stage of argumentation, it's here where Thomas argues that, where he asks us to consider a hypothesis. Just think of a being whose essence is its existence. Just entertain the thought of it, and let's do a wee bit of conceptual analysis and see what that would be like. Okay, and he's going to say a number of things about that, what that would be like. His primary intention here is to show that it is radically unique, utterly unique. There is nothing that could be like this except being this thing. Like, just think about that. That it's radically unique. Nothing could be like it, and we're going to see how he argues that. Everything else, then, other than it, okay, is not radically unique. It may be individual, but it's not as unique as this thing whose essence is its existence. So, as we're going to see, this argumentation sets up, this being whose essence is its existence as being immaterial, one, unique, and all the rest. But just think about the radical uniqueness there. It means that any other being then has a derived or participated uniqueness and is an individual, but still has some commonality with other individuals. This thing is entirely other, entirely transcendent, entirely unique. And that, feeds into divine simplicity, immutability, and all the rest. So, that's just to kind of, point out where we're going here. Obviously, the third stage, Thomas is going to offer a demonstration that this being whose essence is its existence doesn't, in fact, exist and can be known to exist. But at this stage, we're just doing the conceptual analysis of what it would be like to be that thing.
Just hypothetical at this stage. Just hypothetical at this stage. And then later, he makes a demonstration for its actual inclusion in reality, right? So, important.
Yeah. That's it. So in the actual Ente argumentation, Thomas says, right now, so think of this being whose essence is its existence. Such a thing could only be one and unique, because if its essence is its existence, it would be pure subsistent existence itself. Okay, it would just be pure existence. Okay, and it would be subsistent existence because it would be in virtue of what it is. It wouldn't subsist in anything else. And this is going to be important for his later argumentation. Well, Thomas says we can know that this would be one and unique. Remember, we're just thinking hypothetically here. We can know that this would be one and unique if we consider how things are multiplied. And he takes us through three different ways in which things can be multiplied. So the first way in which something can be multiplied is as a genus is multiplied into its species. And a genus is multiplied into a species by the addition of some differentiating feature. The differentiating feature specifies the genus and gives you the species. It's there in the language itself. There's a specification of the genus by the differentiating feature. So you've got the genus animal, differentiating feature of rationality. You have rational animals. So you have the human species, and you can do the same for horses and dogs and all the rest. Then another way things could be multiplied is a step down from that. Species multiplied into individuals. And then similarly, a species is multiplied into individuals by the addition of matter. So matter then is a principle by which a species is multiplied into the various individuals of the species. So you've got Peter, James, and John are all individual men. Okay. Now they're individual men because the species human, okay, is received in the diverse chunks of matter, which, go to make up Peter, James, and John. And now here's the really cool thing. One might want to say, oh, well, here, Thomas, you're, presupposing the metaphysics of genus and species and individuals, and matter as a principle of individuation. Have a look at the Ente Essentia chapters 1 to 3 if you want a wee defense of that from Aquinas himself. So he's defended that already in chapters 1 to 3. All right. So he's allowed to presuppose that because he's given the defense of it. So that's another way in which things can be multiplied. And then a third way in which something can be multiplied is if you have some separated or fundamental, sort of source, and things participate in that. So the example Thomas uses is fire, or heat. If you had some separate source of fire or heat, things would come along and they would be heated or put on fire by this source of fire or heat. And the sun is the obvious example here. We all participate in the light of the sun and the heat from the sun, the energy from the sun. Mm-hmm. Now, what Thomas proceeds to do is to argue that this hypothetical being, whose essence is its existence, could not be multiplied in the first two ways, as a genus is multiplied in the species and species in the individuals. And for some reason, well, I know the reason, he doesn't consider the third way. Mm-hmm. Now, maybe we should just, get that out of the way first. Why does he not consider the third way of multiplication as something separated is multiplied by the individuals that participate in it? Well, let's take the sun example. Okay, so you got the sun, it's one, it's singular. Okay, not exactly unique. There's other stars like that, but you've got it there and it's singular. And the things on Earth are illuminated by it, by the rays of the sun. They're heated by it, and they get their energy from it. But all those different things, those multiple things that participate in the light of the sun, they don't multiply the sun. It's still just the one sun that these multiple things are participating in. Multiplication is already there, and these things simply participate in whatever causal reality it is they're participating in. So the thing that is participated in is not multiplied itself by multiple participants.
Yes.
That's the point. Mm-hmm. Okay. So it still remains one and separate, even though you have multiple participants participating in it. So the reason why Thomas doesn't consider that form of multiplication is because it's not threatening to what it wants to establish. Because even if you had, you got this thing which is pure existence itself, and all other existence participated in it for their existence, well, it still wouldn't be multiplied in the same way that the sun isn't multiplied. And in fact, that's going to be Thomas's vision for the relationship between creatures and God. So with that out of the way, we take the first two forms of multiplication. So we've got this hypothesis, a being whose essence is its existence. Right. Where do we go from there? Can it be multiplied? Well, let's take the first form of multiplication. As a genus is multiplied into its species by the addition of some differentiating feature. So you got the genus animal, the differentiating feature of rationality, canininity, felininity, and with the addition of rationality, you got humans, the addition of, canininity, you've got dogs, the addition of felininity, you've got cats, evil, demonic little creatures. And I know people push back on me on that one. So I have to put it back in there. Yes, cats.
We got to get comments on this video somehow. So there you go. Yeah.
Cats are still demonic little creatures. I've moved to a new house and there's there's 5 cats just floating about. My wife befriended a stray cat and she wanted to bring it in. So
that's funny. Yeah, that's what my grandmother does. Yeah.
That right. Yeah. So when I'm not about, my wife is trying to befriend all these, stray cats and bring them in. So that has to be a big no from me. Anyway. So that's how a genus is multiplied into its species. Okay. And the differentiating feature is outside the genus. It's not part of the genus. If it were, the genus would be essentially characterized by that differentiating feature. So if rationality was part of the genus animal, every animal would be rational. So it can only be specified by some differentiating feature outside of the genus. Okay. Right. Can something that is pure existence itself, something whose essence is identical to its existence, can it be multiplied in the way in which a genus is multiplied? So in this case, pure existence would be like the genus animal. So could it be multiplied by some differentiating feature outside of it? Well, what's outside pure existence? Nothing. There is nothing outside pure existence, which is not being caused by pure existence, okay, which could specify it. Right. So there's nothing outside of pure existence to which it stands as subject for specification. Whereas the genus animal, okay, there is, some sort of specifying principle independent of it, which is rationality, to which it stands as subject in order to be specified.
Yes. Okay. Yes.
So that's how generic, genus to species multiplication works. You need some independent principle of differentiation to which the genus stands as subject and by which it is specified. Right. But something that's pure existence itself, it couldn't have anything independent of it to which it stands as subject for specification. So it can't be multiplied in that first way as a genus is multiplied. So for Aquinas, that's out. Right. So let's consider the next one. As a species is multiplied into its individuals because a species is received in distinct chunks of matter. So Peter, James, and John all instantiate the species human, and so we have individual humans, Peter, James, and John, distinct chunks of matter. Aquinas will not only say that this again presupposes some sort of principle outside of the thing being multiplied, to which it stands as subject to multiply it. So outside of the species human, you need these distinct chunks of matters in which the species human is instantiated. Okay. But we've just seen that there's nothing outside of pure existence that could, specify it or to which it stands as subject. So the same would be the case here. Matter can't exist outside of pure existence by which to multiply it. But not only that, let's say, even if per impossibile, there were some sort of matter which multiplied pure existence, well, then the pure existence that were thereby multiplied, there would be pure existence itself, but there would be material pure existence. But material things, okay, they don't subsist in themselves. They subsist in their matter. The only reason why I continue to exist and go on existing is because my matter is constantly being nourished and kept in existence. If I stop eating and drinking, if I stop breathing air, if the conditions for my material existence just fall apart, then I fall apart. I cease to be. I don't simply exist in virtue of being me. I exist in virtue of all these different material components.
Right.
Okay. I subsist in virtue of all these material components. I exist in virtue of my active existence. Mm-hmm. Something that's pure existence itself, its essence is its existence. It exists and therefore subsists in virtue of what it is, not in virtue of anything independent of it, but in virtue of what it is. So because material things don't subsist in virtue of what they are, but in virtue of their matter, whereas pure existence subsists in virtue of what it is, pure existence can't be material. And so it can't be multiplied in a material fashion. So material multiplication is out.
It's out. Mm-hmm.
Now, let's take stock, first of all. What does this establish? Now, we're going to see, is this exhaustive? Are there other forms of multiplication that Thomas might have missed? But let's take stock now. God isn't considered, if God exists, pure existence itself, if he exists, then he's not some sort of collective genus, that just sort of contains everything like a number of species. He's not a genus within which all and every species consists, because then God would be just like some thin veneer, widest in denotation, least in connotation. There would be no sort of content to God's being other than just to have this shrink wrap placed over things, given the glossy look about them, making them be. Right. So God's not like that. But also, pure existence itself couldn't be material. Just in principle could not be material. So if God exists, he can't be material. Must be immaterial. So can't be identified with the material universe. So there you go.
So you can see how this is already doing a lot of work, right? If this reasoning is solid, then whatever is first and fundamental and primary in an ontological sense, we're already seeing that it can only not be this physical universe. It couldn't be any physical universe, right? So it would just completely get around arguments that either need to try and establish the beginning of the physical universe, or it would get around the proposal of multiverses infinitely. Like this argument would just cut right through all that stuff, right? Which is super handy, right? Yeah,
absolutely. Because to reiterate, it's a metaphysical argument. We're doing metaphysics here. Yeah. And so even if you have multiverses, whatever you have, when we do metaphysics, we look at the being of things and, what are the conditions without which it would be impossible to be. And when we do that, that just cuts across all of that stuff, multiverses, whatever. When we get to the cold, hard metaphysics of the matter and prove God from that, then we've already cut across all that stuff anyway. So they don't really come into it.
Right. Yeah. Excellent. Okay. Keep finishing your train of thought here, and then I'll chime in with some considerations.
Okay. Awesome. So the third thing then, go back to that God isn't just some greatest genus, a thin veneer given a glossy, look on things, which is their existence. Okay. Think of a genus, right? a genus is found everywhere its species is found and doesn't exist independently of its species. So it's not like the genus animal is sort of floating, unless you're a Platonist, it's not floating about up here somewhere. And then even Platonists, some Platonists would deny the existence of genera, right? Mm-hmm. But it's not some sort of thing floating about up here, there, or wherever. It's found in amongst the things. And then the genus is really just this abstracted totality that all the species have in common. Well, pure existence itself isn't like that. Pure existence itself, it's not like the Force, okay, which emerges, like, Star Wars, the Force just emerges from all life. Pure existence itself isn't just some sort of emergent world spirit, or some sort of pantheism or pantheistic sort of entity that, all things are identified with. Aquinas' argument against generic multiplication of pure existence itself goes to undermine any kind of pantheism. That pure existence itself can't be identified with the individual existence that participate in pure existence. Right. And I think that's an important point to make as well.
Right. So maybe we can think about it in terms of like, it can't have any boundedness or restrictedness, right? Yeah. It's going to have to be completely unbounded. I know I was just talking about Barry Miller's quite excellent book on Facebook the other day. And I think he's really just giving a sort of contemporary reflection on so many of Aquinas's insights. And he's talking about God has to be the limit case of existence, not the limit simpliciter. And the difference being that God so radically transcends these categories. He's not just a higher degree of certain things, right? He escapes these categories altogether as the limit case versus, a limit simpliciter would be something like, if you take a speed, maybe the maximum speed anybody could reach maybe is the speed of light, right? But take a limit case, which is where all these particular categories sort of converge, take 0. Well, that's not a degree of speed, right? But it's clearly still related to those categories. And I just think that that's a really useful way of thinking about this. And I think it's pretty consistent. Obviously, Miller's using his own language and his own metaphors and stuff like that. But to kind of wrap your mind around the transcendence of God and not think that, for example, once we get into the divine attributes of the will, like whatever God's knowledge is, we shouldn't just think of it like human knowledge where we just crank the dial up on the number of true propositions God knows. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, yeah. And I've been engaged with that sort of literature as well. So yeah, I know what you mean there. That's the transcendence. That's the God is per se. Everything else is per aliud, as the argument goes. So if God is per se, then there can't be any limit if he's genuinely per se, because anything with a limit is through another in some sort of way, and the other stands at the limit, limiting, the thing which does have limits. Yeah,
limits boundaries mark off further potentials, right?
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
But you're going to, and this is key, just to kind of maybe put some more contemporary language on it, right? If you're going to have multiplication of different entities, you're going to need limits, right?
Yeah.
You're going to need these boundaries, and that's going to be incompatible with that which exists through itself, right? And once you see this, once you comprehend it, however you come to it, which I think this is the key insight of Aquinas' argument, then we have, if it exists hypothetically, whatever this thing is that exists to itself, it's going to be, I like you say radically unique. I've also heard the term uniquely unique. I think that's kind of a cool way of putting it too.
Yeah.
And then, okay, immediately you can see like, well, whatever else that thing is, it's probably almost certainly God. We can say it is certainly God when we do more conceptual analysis, but even like right there, we're seeing it's immaterial, it's uniquely unique. Like, what other candidates would there even be right off the bat? It's hard to think, right? But we can and will go further, once we continue to analyze it. And then we'll have to put some type of further argumentation in place to say that this hypothetical is actual. But I just want to continue to emphasize right now, we're just doing the conceptual analysis, right?
Yeah. Okay. Very cool. So, I mean, that brings us then to, the last point in considering this argumentation is, has Aquinas exhaustively considered every type of multiplication? So he's only considered these two, and then the third one, he raises, but he doesn't really deal with. And maybe there are more forms of multiplication, but here's Aquinas' insight. And this is why I think it ties in with why I think the first stage only gives us a conceptual distinction between essence and existence. And it's because the second stage is doing conceptual analysis. So at the first stage, remains with a conceptual distinction, starts at the conceptual level. The second stage remains at the conceptual level, okay, because we're doing this sort of a priori conceptual analysis. So I think those who hold at the first stage, is concerned with real distinction, have trouble then sort of with the hypothetical or conceptual nature of the second stage. It's that there's not a seamless transition from one stage to the other. There seems to be a bit of a break there. And now we're at the conceptual level at stage 2, but stage 1 on their reading is, real things, where stage 2, it's conceptual analysis, that seems to have seams to it.
Yeah, and that is a really good interpretive point. And I would say I think I lean with you on that interpretation. And then I would just say on the other question that there's just been some cool developments in thought that just say, how far can we go with this argument? But we could do a whole nother episode on that some other time. We've talked about it before many other times, but I want to stay focused on this one here, but that's a good interpretive point.
Unfortunately, if we start talking about that, I might end up disagreeing with, philosophers living philosophers that I like and respect and whose work I've read.
It's such an inter-Thomistic debate anyways. And it's not essential to what we're trying to do here today. So we can just leave it to one side. Right.
So, well, look, are there other sorts of forms of multiplications? And this is the thing with Thomas. Think about how I was, putting it across those first 2 forms of multiplication. The genus is subject to a differentiating feature. The species is subject to material instantiation. In each case, the things which are being multiplied are subject to some principle of multiplication independent of them, and which exercises some sort of causal actuality over them. It multiplies them. It specifies them in the case of the genus and the difference. The difference specifies the genus. It does something to the genus and, it turns it into its species. Matter does something to the species. It allows the species to be present in the world. In each case, there's subjectivity to actuality on the point of the thing being multiplied. But think about this. The thing that we have when we're thinking about is something which is pure existence itself. It is subject to nothing for any kind of actuality. Elsewhere, Aquinas says that, existence, or esse, is the act of all acts, the perfection of all perfections. There is nothing independent of it to which it stands as subject that could actualize it in any way. Quite the contrary. Anything which has any degree of actuality has it from what is pure existence itself. Because think about existence. There is no actuality without existence. Every actuality is some form of existing. That's what it is. To be actual in any sort of way is to have existence in some specified sort of manner. So if you've got something which is pure existence then, with no admixture of potency, just pure existence, then you have something which is pure actuality. Okay, the two are coterminous for Aquinas. They're synonymous for Aquinas. Pure existence, pure actuality.
Right.
That being the case, then there is no principle independent of it which could multiply it in any way. Nothing that can multiply it. Anything that exists independently of it has been caused to exist by it, is dependent on it for its existence. Right. And no cause is caused in its actuality by its effect. So the actuality of the cause is not caused by the actuality of the effect. That being the case, what is pure existence itself there stands in potency or subject to nothing for multiplication, in which case, in principle, it can't be multiplied. Regardless of whether it exists, in principle, it can't be multiplied.
Yeah. Huge, right? So we have this sort of active existence existing through itself, right? In order to have, and maybe this is a different reading on it. I know we were talking about this before, right? But to have more than one of these things, right? We need some differentiating feature, right? But for something to be different than that which exists through itself, it would either have to be not actual or not existing through itself, which means it would stand in need of activation. It would have to be some type of caused dependent reality, right? So that can't be used. That isn't going to work, right? Then we would have something that is both uncaused and caused, and clearly that's a contradiction. That just isn't gonna fly, right? So the idea here is what you're saying, like in principle, if this thing exists, we're not going to be able to have multiple instances of it. And you can come at it from many different ways. You can do the traditional sort of, genus species thing that we've done. You can kind of just do the broad overlook that I just sort of outlined. You could take Barry Miller's approach and just talk about boundaries and limits and what those imply and why that wouldn't apply to the sort of limit case of existence. So it is cool to see that there's kind of different ways of making ultimately the same move. Maybe they're all the same move, just using different language. I'm not entirely sure about that, but you actually, Gavin, because I don't want to bring anyone here who can't defend themselves, right? There are people who say, there are certain philosophers that we hold in high regard, right, that have certain readings of this argument, this Thomistic proof. And maybe you think they're good, but you've said, I don't read the argument this way. And I know you probably know which ones I'm thinking about. I don't know if you want to say anything about that now, or if we should just keep going ahead.
Yeah. So I know there's a reading of this kind of argument here that, seeks to establish the unicity, the uniqueness of God, of pure existence itself, that would say, well, let's say hypothetically you had two gods or two pure existences itself. And then the question is, well, how would we distinguish between the two of them?
How could you tell them apart? Yeah.
We would need some difference principle, and that would either be, some sort of different, differentia, the way a genus is differentiated, or it would be some material difference principle, and so on. And I just don't think that's the argument that Aquinas is making here. He's not asking how could you tell them apart if there were two of them. He's pointing out that in principle there could not be two of them. Right. So the whole issue,
that's a different procedure. Procedure. Yeah. I see that.
So, I mean, the whole issue of how could you tell them apart is not what he's after. Now, I think, as memory serves me, there is an argument in Contra Gentiles, book 2, where Aquinas does something like that of what those other philosophers, say that, well, look, how could you tell one apart from the other? Okay. And, this raises, issues, with Leibniz, the identity of indiscernibles and all that, which I kind of don't want to get into because that's a bog and a minefield. I just don't think Thomas is getting into that. Thomas has just shown that in principle, this thing couldn't be multiplied. So the whole issue of how you could tell the difference between the two of them, he's not really concerned about that because, I mean, why would he be if he's already established that can't be multiplied anyway? So we don't need to worry about how you can tell the difference.
Yeah. So one other thing I just want to highlight now, and we'll maybe talk about this more later, is that, if you have this sort of active existence existing through itself, and you're not going to be able to multiply it out, it's not going to be susceptible to differentiating features, then it's going to be, in the word used before, is it's going to be pure. Right, it's going to be a pure act of existence existing through itself, which is itself going to rule out compositeness, right? So, already we see the emergence of divine simplicity here. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, that's was going to be the next point, that we get on to divine simplicity from this. So, should we take it from there?
Wherever you want to take it, I will follow your lead. Yeah,
wonderful. So we have this being, and it's radically unique. Okay. There is nothing that could be like this unless it just were this being. Okay, so that's going to get us into divine simplicity. Now, just remember Thomas's strategy here. He hasn't established that this being exists. He's concerned with establishing the distinction between essence and existence. Now, as I read this stage, and I'm following John Whipple in this, it's not original to me. Whipple argues that what Thomas is doing here is he's showing that, if it is a feature of something that is pure existence itself, that it couldn't be multiplied in any way, that it would be impossible for it to be multiplied in any way, so that if it's impossible for something that's pure existence to be multiplied, then anything that is multiple is not pure existence itself. So if you have multiple beings, they are not pure existence itself, i.e., they are not beings in which essence and existence are identical. So if you have multiple beings, they are beings in which essence and existence are distinct.
Right. So then we see that the plurality becomes a flag for us, right? To say, okay, we've got, let's bring up cats again, right? Lots of cats, right? The fact that we have a plurality of cats shows that whatever else the fundamental, most primary reality is, if there is one out there that exists to itself, it's not a cat, right?
Thank God.
It's not a cat, thank God.
Yeah.
All right. So good. Yeah, continue.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, so that's just to, situate the strategy here. So what he's doing, at least in my reading, following Whipple, is that he's establishing distinction of essence, existence, real distinction at this stage, because, epistemic realism, there are real multiple things in the world. And so those real multiple things, medium-sized dry goods, are composites of essence and existence. And then that's going to springboard, the proof for God. But so we have this being, we don't know it exists yet, but, something whose essence is its existence. It would have to be radically unique. It is per se, it subsists in virtue of what it is. It's pure existence, pure actuality, right? That means it has to be utterly simple. Why? Because anything which isn't utterly simple, in principle, is composed of act and potency. There's some sort of potentiality in it, which is actualized. But this thing, hypothetical thing, which is pure existence, has no element of potentiality, which could be actualized. It is pure actuality itself, per se actual, in which case all the standard forms of composition, such as that of essence and existence, supposit and nature, matter and form, substance and accident, they could not apply to this thing in principle,
right? Because
this thing has no potentiality to be actualized. So it's utterly and radically simple.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. And I think this is, again, critical to show that, like, doing the metaphysics up front, it certainly does commit you to a particular conception of God, but I think it solves so many otherwise unnecessary issues if you just take the time to do this initially, to do it upstream rather than downstream, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah.
And same thing is, once we understand that there's no boundedness or compositeness, right? Like, we need limits and bounds to differentiate a whole from its parts as well. And none of that's going to apply, right? Which is another affirmation of whatever else this thing is. It's going to have to be pure. It's going to have to be simple. It's going to have to be non-composite, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And we can go on beyond that. It's pure actuality. It's immutable. Has no potentiality. Mutability requires potentiality, because changeability means standing in some sort of potency which can be actualized. That's what makes you changeable. And if it is actualized, then you have changed. So because this is pure actuality, it's immutable. Because it's immutable, it's eternal. Because there's no change in it. So there's no before and after. Within a process of change. It is all at once. It's lacking succession. It's infinite because it's got no boundary. It's pure actuality. It's not bounded by anything. So
and we don't mean that it's like an infinite spatial extension or anything like that, because it's immaterial, right?
Yeah.
So it's a qualitative infinity, not a quantitative one.
So the duration of this hypothetical being's life is not measured by time, or what the medievals called sempiternity or aviternity, which is applicable to the angels. The duration or the actuality of this hypothetical being's life is measured by eternity. Lack of succession, infinite, unbounded, all at once. So there we are. Immutability, simplicity, immutability, eternity. We could do goodness as well, but you can kind of get the idea that just considering pure existence itself, we haven't even established that it can be known to exist, but just considering it gets us, these divine attributes. So if we can establish that this thing exists, we have God.
Right. And really, we have classical theism.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Yeah, absolutely. Which is why it's so important, to read this argument, as part and parcel of Aquinas' metaphysics, because classical theism isn't just about the theism bit. It's about the whole metaphysical worldview within which that is situated.
Yeah, excellent. So, obviously, again, we're sort of giving the highlights here, but we are trying to be pretty substantial as well, as much as we can for a podcast. Are there any other points of clarification or important objections at this point of the argument that you think should be considered before we start trying to move from the hypothetical to the actual?
No, I think we should just go for it. Go for the, the demonstration of God's
Let's do it. All right. So all right. If this thing exists, it's going to be like we've just described, but who's to say it exists, right?
Yeah.
Maybe it's just in our minds, right? How do we make that move? Yeah.
Okay. So next, the all important stage 3. This is a proof for God's existence. So Thomas starts by announcing a causal principle, that a thing has certain features either as a result of its intrinsic nature, or as a result of some extrinsic principle. So the two examples that he gives, an example of some sort of intrinsic feature that a thing has is risability in man. So if you're a rational animal, you're able to laugh. Why are you able to laugh? Because you're rational. Okay. You're a subject of experience and you can get humor. Okay. So rationality is not always about, cogitation and cognition. Okay. Rationality also involves, being a subject of experience and experiencing humor. And that's a really, really interesting one, to bring up in discussion about the personhood of those that have particular, neurological disabilities that may not have higher levels of cognition, but are subjects of experience, because you can see the joy, the laughter, the happiness, which they have, which no non-rational animal has. I think it's important to bring that up anyway. Again, part and parcel of the metaphysics of the matter. Anyway, so you're able to laugh because you're rational. That's in virtue of what you are. So you have an essence, and that gives rise to these particular features such as risability. But then the other example Thomas uses, for something dependent on an extrinsic principle is the illumination of the atmosphere. So let's say the illumination of our atmosphere, it's getting dark here in Maynooth. I shouldn't say the sun's going down, the world is turning and the horizon is moving upwards, just to be correct about it. But in any case, it's no longer being illuminated by the sun. The atmosphere is not self-illuminating, so it depends on that extrinsic principle of illumination, which is the sun. Okay, great. What about the existence of things? Well, we come to this demonstration of God's existence armed with the distinction between essence and existence. At whatever stage he establishes it. At the first stage, if you're with Fieser and Oderberg and the rest of them, if it's at the first stage, okay, well and good. If it's at the second stage, it's established, such as, Whipple and I argue, well and good. But at least in this third stage, Thomas enters this demonstration with the distinction between essence and existence. Why? Because in considering the existence of things, Thomas holds that things have existence in the way that the atmosphere is illuminated by the light of the sun, i.e. in the way that the atmosphere is illuminated. Not in virtue of itself and being the atmosphere, but in virtue of something extrinsic. If things had existence as identical to their essences, then they would have existence as a feature in the way that we have risability as a feature. And then the argument just wouldn't get off the ground, because these things would exist in virtue of what they are. But it's precisely because essence and existence are distinct in them that we can look for some sort of principle or cause of their existence. So for those who deny that Thomas intended the real distinction, at this point of the argument, they can't get that proof for God's existence off the ground.
Right.
And he's not here to defend himself, but he's dead and, probably enjoying the beatific vision. Joseph Owens. So he's not going to care, okay, if I criticize him. Joseph Owens held that, even at this stage, Thomas hasn't established real distinction of essence and existence. It's all conceptual still at this stage. It's only when you prove that God exists and things receive existence from God that you have real distinction. Okay. And, Whipple and Owens had a back and forth on this issue quite a bit. In any case, I can't see how Thomas's proof of God at this stage of the argument could get off the ground unless essence and existence are really distinct.
I completely agree. I don't see how you would have the juice for the argument if it hasn't been established 100%.
Yeah. Now Owens is a brilliant Thomist, one of the greatest, Thomists, metaphysicians, historians of philosophy of the 20th century. So, if he were here, I'm sure he would have something to say. And he could argue his case. But he's not here. He's dead. God rest him. Probably enjoying the beatific vision. But we can't be presumptuous on any of that. But still, he's not here. So we'll press on. So things have existence, but they're not identical to the existence that they have. They have it through another, through some sort of extrinsic principle. They don't have it like risability in terms of in virtue of their essence. They have it in virtue of something other than themselves. So they exist per aliud, per participationem, through another. And remember when I said at the start, I think the form of all Aquinas' proofs is this move from what is per aliud or per participationem to what is per se. Aquinas reasons that what is per aliud or through another is reducible to what is per se. So what is per aliud in a certain respect, the respect in this case being existence, is reduced to what is per se in that respect, i.e. what is per se with respect of existence, i.e. whose essence is its existence, the hypothetical being we were just considering.
Right.
All right.
Right.
So things in which essence and existence are distinct have existence through another. They are reducible to what has existence through itself, i.e. what is pure existence. How can he justify that? How does he justify that? Well, he distinguishes between two different kinds of causal series, per se and a per accidens causal series. In a per accidens causal series, the members of the series possess the causality of the series in themselves in virtue of what they are. So the example here, the typical example here is a series of fathers producing sons. Mm-hmm. So you have Peter, James, and John. Peter is the father of James, and James is the father of John. Okay, wonderful. How is Peter the father of James? Well, because he's, one important feature of it is that he's a biologically functioning male. He produces James. How is James the father of John? Well, James is a biologically functioning male, and he can father John. So the causality in that series is paternity, fatherhood, right? Mm-hmm. Peter can be a father because of the kind of thing that he is. A man, mature man, and, he can do what needs to be done to become a father. Same for James, same for John. Crucially, Peter is the father of James and the grandfather of John. Peter is not the father of John. Peter is not the cause of John in terms of fatherhood. James does not need Peter's help to father John. Okay, James can do what needs to be done to father John without Peter. Peter can be dead. Mm-hmm. John's grandfather can be dead before John even comes into existence at the moment of conception.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So
he doesn't need to borrow that power from what preceded him, right? To produce the effect, right? He's got it in virtue of what he is. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So a per accidens series, the members of the series have the causality, that causal feature of the series in virtue of what they are. Mm-hmm. Now, let's consider a per se causal series. In a per se causal series, the members of the series do not have the causality of the series in virtue of what they are. You take a hand, a stick, and the stone. Okay, a hand moving a stick to move the stone. Hands, sticks, and stones don't have motion in themselves in virtue of what they are. Mm-hmm. All right? They're just hands, sticks, and stones. They're immobile in virtue of what they are. How is a hand moved? The agent moves the hand. Okay, and so let's step outside the context of agent causality and what agency is. Let's just say the mind moves the hand to move the stick to move the stone. Okay, mm-hmm. So the hand, stick, and stone in this causal series, they don't have the causality of the series in themselves. So as you say, they borrow it or they participate in that mm-hmm. causality. They have motion per allude or through another.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So what is that other from which they have motion? Right. Not the other from which the hand. Just the hand has motion, then the stick and the stone, but the other from which all three have the motion in which they participate, it's the mind. Mm-hmm. Okay, the mental agent communicates motion to the hand and to the stick and to the stone, so that it is the mental agent which is the cause of the motion of the hand and of the stick and of the stone. The hand isn't the cause of the motion of the stick nor the stick of the stone in any primary sort of sense, only in a secondary sense as instruments of the mental agent.
Yeah.
The primary cause here is the mental agent, precisely because in the mental agent, the causality of the series is found essentially in virtue of what it is.
Yeah.
Because a mental agent can, in virtue of being a mental agent, originate causality. Right. That's what it is. That's what it is to be minded. Mm-hmm. Sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, and I love certain, I think, terms help here, and instrumentality or derived, the power being derived is helpful too, because it doesn't matter how many intermediaries they are, right? I mean, sometimes the analogy is given as like, look, it doesn't matter if you make the handle of the paintbrush infinitely long, right? That isn't going to solve the issue of where does the motion come from, because a paintbrush, in virtue of what it is, isn't a self mover, right? Mm-hmm. So however many you can string together as many paintbrushes as you want, you can extend the handle as long as you want, it isn't going to solve the issue until we get to something that does have the power of motion in virtue of what it is. Another one that we've given before, Gavin, just to get the illustration out that I think is sometimes helpful, is like you're in the bedroom and there's kind of light shining in the bedroom, and outside there's the big full moon, right?
Yeah.
Somebody asks, well, why is there light in the bedroom? And somebody will say, well, because the moon is there. And that's true in a sense. It's a partial explanation, but we want to know more, because we know that a moon, in virtue of what it is, doesn't have the power to produce light. It just has the power to reflect light. And it wouldn't help us if we just have 4 moons, right? You see that? That doesn't answer the question of why is the bedroom, where's that property of illumination coming from, right? It can't be the moons. They're just intermediaries. They're instruments, right? Put an infinite number of moons there. Doesn't matter, right? Because an infinite amount of 0 is still 0. So, or put the moons in a circle. Doesn't matter, right? And I think once you grasp this principle, it's really powerful that it doesn't matter how many intermediaries there are. It doesn't matter how you arrange them, right? We're going to have to get back to some primary, some fundamental, in this case, maybe a star or something like that, something that does have the power to produce light or emit photons or whatever in virtue of what it is, to make sense of the question of, well, why is my room being currently illuminated, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So here in the per se series, you have things which are through another. So the hand, the stick, and the stone are in motion through another, which is the mind or the mental agent. And the mental agent has that causality in virtue of what it is. It doesn't borrow it from anything, just in virtue of being a mental agent. It can originate that causality. The sun, the moon, and the bedroom example is another good one. The fire heating the pot, heating the contents of the pot is another good one. All these examples of per se series, the members of the series would not have the causality they have in the series. So they would be causally blank. They'd be causally inefficacious, were it not for their participating in some primary cause, which has that causality per se. And it's primary precisely because it doesn't have the causality of the series in a derived or secondary manner. Doesn't mean that it's first, just means that it has it per se.
Right.
Back now to our essence existence composites. Things have existence, but they don't have it essentially, right? So they have existence from an extrinsic principle. So now we have some sort of causal series. We have things with existence depending on some sort of extrinsic principle. There's some principle of their existence. Is that causal series like the Praxeton's ones, Peter, James, and John, the fathers and sons, whereby the causal property, existence or fatherhood in the other case, isn't borrowed, but they have it in virtue of what they are? Or is it existence possessed more like the hand and the stick and the stone in their possession of motion? They have it through another, and then they depend on something which just has that, causality in virtue of what it is, i.e. per se. Well, we've already seen, up to this point, the argumentation for distinction of essence and existence, that things have that causal actuality, i.e. existence, not in virtue of what they are. So not in the way that Peter, James, and John have paternity, okay? Not in virtue of the kinds of things that they are. Rather, they have it in the way that the hand, stick, and the stone have motion. They have it distinct from themselves, not in virtue of what they are, but in virtue of something else. So that unless there is some sort of cause for the existence that they have, a cause of their causality, which cause possesses the causality of the series essentially or per se, they themselves would have nothing in which to participate for their existence, in which case they would not exist.
Right. There would just be nothing.
Exactly. But given that they do exist, there is something which does have existence per se, or just is per se existence, in which they participate in order to be. And what did we see in the previous stage that this must be like? Radically unique, immaterial, simple, immutable, eternal, all the rest. Everything that we established about pure existence, we now see that this cause, without which things in which essence and existence are distinct would not be, that this cause actually exists. And we know it actually exists from that demonstration. And here's everything that we showed about that prior to that demonstration. And, well, that primary cause then is God. Cause of all things, simple, immutable, eternal, and all the rest.
Right. Yeah. Beautiful. Beautiful. It's like you've been through this before, Gavin. It seemed very well rehearsed. It's like you've almost written a book-like treatment on it and teach at a university and stuff like that. So let me throw maybe a sort of stock objection here. Sometimes people will say, well, look, maybe there can be a primary cause of things in one direction, but why think that this is the primary cause of things in all directions, right? You sometimes hear this, right? Yeah. And yeah, I've talked about this before, but I think it'd be cool just to hear your perspective on this, right? So,
right,
you know the objection I'm talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what do we say in the second stage about this thing whose essence is its existence? It stands subject to nothing. everything stands in potency to it. So everything derives whatever actuality, any actuality that it has, from it. Okay. So insofar as it is the primary cause of existence, remember, existence is the principle of actuality. All actualities are just forms of existing. All right. You would not have any actuality were it not for the actuality of existence. Insofar as this is the cause of existence, that in which everything participates for existence, any actuality that anything has, no matter what, derives its actuality from this as primary cause. So if you have any sort of, causal series or causal actuality whatsoever, ultimately is derived from this primary cause of existence.
They all piggyback on this,
yes.
right? They're all less fundamental. So like this is the primary cause and has to be the primary cause, full stop, across the board, right?
Yeah, because nothing would be actual without this. So if you have any causal actuality, it's always going to be actual because of this.
Yeah, excellent. Gaven, there's some questions that came in on YouTube from when we were supposed to do a live stream. Is there anything else you want to say about the argument so far? I know we've talked about this in previous conversations, and I will invite people to go and revisit those because there's probably different aspects that we covered in those that we haven't covered in this one. But yeah, anything else you want to just say in general? And then if you're cool with it, maybe we could take a few questions.
Not in particular, just maybe it's reflecting, my particular, state of research at the minute, whereby I'm considering, Aquinas's thoughts more generally and how to address objections to it. And it's just just to read what Thomas actually says, or if you're reading, sort of what I'm arguing, read the actual words, in the actual argument and try to come to terms with that instead of, a generic summary or something like that, just to, and this is the advice I would always give to my students as well. Engage with a philosopher on their own terms.
Yes.
Try not to engage with them in, secondary literature. The secondary literature buttresses the primary literature. And I say that having written a piece of secondary literature on a proof from Aquinas, it's just there to buttress the primary sort of stuff. Engage with a philosopher on their own terms, and try not to read into it something that the philosopher isn't saying. But I suppose that just reflects where I'm at in my research.
No, it's so good. I often say, one of the things I'm very thankful for in my philosophical education, especially in my master's program, really in the master's side, was just the absolute insistence on the primary text. Right? It's so invaluable. And that's not to say that secondary texts don't have their place. I mean, your book is awesome, right? You can get a lot of secondary texts, but they don't replace the primary engagement with the original.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. All right, let's do a few questions. Are you cool with that, Gaven? Got a few minutes?
Absolutely. I'm available. Yep.
All right. Here, the first one comes from Brendan Sheehan, and here's kind of a general question. Brendan wants to know, are there any challenges to Thomism that, to your mind, are difficult to defeat? And if so, what are they?
Right. So this is a great question, and it's one that I've been asked, several times. The way earlier we were discussing how, Thomas does the metaphysics first, and that just cuts across a lot of things. So it cuts across, a lot of objections which could come, from multiverse theory. It'll cut across issues, come up in science, because Thomas is considering what it is to be. So a proof from God's existence established on the basis of what it is to be, will be immune to all those, criticisms drawn from lesser sort of sciences.
Right.
Well, I think the strongest objections to Thomism aren't ones which are sort of, these direct, sort of toe-to-toe arguments against Thomas's arguments. In the way that you get, Scotus going toe-to-toe with Thomas, or Occam going toe-to-toe with, the arguments. I think they're these cross-cutting objections which, present in particular an entirely different sort of a set of metaphysical principles or a different epistemological worldview. And I think the strongest here, but also the most fruitful for dialogue, comes from Kant, Immanuel Kant.
Right. And is that what made you want to do your PhD in that area, because you saw it as the contender, so to speak?
Yeah, I think so. Not so much for Aquinas' metaphysics, only later, did I really get interested in that, but definitely for the epistemology, for Thomas's epistemic realism. And yeah, I do think the strongest objection here comes from Kant, because it just cuts across everything. Because if Kant is right, the kind of metaphysical project that Aquinas is engaged in is impossible.
He's just going right for the legs, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And I like those, sort of engagements in philosophy. That's what I like to do. I mean, you just used the fighting example. You're going straight for the legs. That's it. You take out the legs, and get it into the ground game, under the ground and pound, and that's game over. Or as somebody said, before to me, I mean, years ago, wow, you're really going for the jugular there, with this sort of stuff. It's it goes beyond those wee nitty gritty sort of arguments, and it goes for the overarching sort of issues. And so I think that those kinds of challenges, which really just try to, uproot Thomism Bat's foundations, are the best sort of challenges and the strongest, and often the hardest to defeat, because it means that you have to think your way entirely into a different system of thought, the way I have with Kant.
You have to really get into the weeds, which is actually great because it makes you a better philosopher at the end of the day, right? To do those types of projects.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's the case because, there are only about a dozen, great philosophers, in the tradition. And there's lots of, sort of other philosophers as well, really worth reading. But there only are really about a dozen in the last 2,000 years: Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, Kant, Hume, Locke, even Descartes, people. And I think they are great is because they do try to uproot, philosophy and, put something else there. And so they're really worth engaging with. But to do that, you really have to think through their entire system of thought. And as you say, it just makes you a better philosopher because it means that you're thinking more systematically. You're not just thinking about wee nitty gritty sort of, gotcha sort of moments in philosophy that for some reason a lot of people like to do. I don't really go in for that, kind of like the gotcha, the knockout punch. I'm more, into just, going right for the legs, as you say, and trying to uproot things.
Well, that I'm largely with you on all those points. I've always thought the biggest threat was just general skepticism, right? Like broad skepticism, right? And I've often said that the reason I'm a theist at the end of the day is because I'm not a skeptic, right?
Yeah.
And that's tough. That is like to defeat like the radical forms of skepticism is really, really tough. Now, most people just I don't think people appreciate how tough it is, right? Now, most people just dismiss it because they think it's silly, right? And it is silly, right? But it's a silly, serious thing. It's serious as in philosophy as like a problem to really wrestle with in terms of, epistemology and cognitive reliability and how much we really have a grip on reality and epistemological realism. So skepticism in one sense is silly, but to my mind, it's always been a supremely interesting and challenging invitation, if you will, right? So I've always seen that as like but that isn't just a problem for Thomism. That's a problem for everything, right? And I think that's part of the reason that people aren't so bothered by like the more extreme skepticism, because they realize like if it's a problem for anyone, it's a problem for everyone. But a problem for everyone is still a problem for Thomism. Right? So,
I think that's a good point. And it's not just confined to skepticism. Kantianism is a problem for everybody except Kantians. Humanism is a problem for everybody except Humeans.
Yeah.
So when you get into these systematic thinkers, they're presenting a problem for everyone because they're presenting an entire sort of worldview buttressed by systematic principles and argumentation. And they're the strongest challenges I think anybody will find in philosophy, because they're sort of inviting you to stop being maybe the philosopher that you are and become the philosopher that they want you to be, such as a Kantian or a Humean or whatever.
Yeah, excellent. Cool question. Thanks for that, Brendan. Next question comes from JC Beats. He wants to know, what Neoplatonic elements of St. Thomas's philosophy do you think people tend to miss?
Yeah. So this is something that came up earlier when we were doing the metaphysics, that, Thomas, in considering the distinction between essence and existence, he's asking, is matter the principle of potency? And so is the correlative principle of matter, form, the principle of actuality? And as we saw in Thomas, matter is not the principle of potency. It's only a principle of potency. The more fundamental principle of potency is essence, which includes form. So so form then is no longer the fundamental principle of actuality. There's some supra-formal principle, or some principle that goes beyond form, which is the principle of actuality. Now, we already see that in Plato's form of the good. It's not quite, the other forms that, it goes beyond the forms and they all participate in it. But in the Neoplatonists, we really see it, in Plotinus, in the one. Okay, the one is some sort of supraformal principle from which even form is derived and to which even form stands in potency. And that's Neoplatonism right there. And you get that in Aquinas, that the act of existence is the act of all acts, to which anything which is actual, including form, stands as subject. And that is, the main Neoplatonic principle of Aquinas' metaphysics. Then you get the whole participation metaphysics that comes after that. I don't think people, that next part of the question, that people tend to overlook. I don't think really, given the last, I was going to say 50 years, but, it's 2020s now, 70 years of scholarship. I don't think that's being overlooked now. I think the Platonic heritage of Thomism is well and truly established after the work of Fabro, Geiger, and then Whipple and Tevelde. That's well known now, but maybe from an outsider looking in, and maybe, from people who would write general histories of philosophy, but maybe wouldn't be as familiar with Thomism, right, they would just say, well, look, this is Aristotelianism. There's nothing of Platonism here. But at least within Thomas circles, that's well known.
I agree. When I first started really getting into Thomism, that seemed pretty apparent to me. Now, maybe that's because I was so attached to like Norris Clark and thinkers and stuff like that. Anyways, good stuff. Let's do one more here, Gavin. This is one that we've been through a million times, but maybe we'll just give a brief response. Catholic Base says, how does the deeper Thomistic metaphysics rule out existential inertia?
Are we still on that?
We're still, it just never.
Is that still a thing?
You know what? This objection has a lot of inertia. I'll give it that.
The amount of emails and messages I've got, from people asking for my Divinitas article on this issue.
That might be my fault, because I've told people that it's okay to ask you for that. So I hope I haven't sent too much trouble your way there.
I even believe somebody translated it into German as
well.
Wow.
He
cool. contacted me to say he used it for one of his classes, translated it into German.
Good.
So I wrote an article, published in a special edition of Divinitas on this issue. And the general argument, much more detail in the Divinitas article. Guys, contact me. I'll send you the article, okay? But the general argument is that when it comes to the existence of a thing, right, when we talk about a cause of a thing's existence, because a thing doesn't have existence in virtue of what it is, it has existence in virtue of some extrinsic principle. The extrinsic principle isn't a cause of a thing having existence. The way if I were to paint some sort of canvas, I would be or if I were to paint the wall of my house, I would be the cause of the walls having whiteness. No, the cause of a thing's existence is the cause of its existence, not just of its having existence, but of its existence.
Yeah, it's not like there's this thing and an existence just goes to inhere in it, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, and this is because things don't have existence in virtue of what they are. So things don't exist in order to have existence, like one Lego block added to another. Okay, things don't exist prior to their having existence. So the cause of the existence of the thing is not the cause of the thing's having existence, because there's nothing there to have the existence in the first place. It is the cause of the thing's existence, such that it would not be at any time that it is, were it not for this thing to cause its existence. Okay, so were this cause of existence to grant me, in essence, existence composite, existence, and then stop, just take a step back, then I would stop existing. In the same way that if you shine a light in a dark room, as soon as you stop shining the light, the room is no longer illuminated. The light ceases. Okay, so that's the fundamental insight in Thomistic metaphysics as to why existential inertia can't be the case, because inertia requires some subsisting subject of existence within which existence remains. So that subject subsists, and existence just remains in it. On the Thomist's view, there is nothing there to receive existence and for existence to remain in it. Rather, the cause of existence is the cause of the thing, because of the existence of the thing. And so that thing remains in existence so long as that thing causes it to exist. And that's the central argument behind the Divinitas article. And in the Divinitas article, I go through different accounts of existential inertia. I've also got an article forthcoming on Aquinas' first way, where I engaged with some accounts of existential inertia, which were published after not so much after the Divinitas article appeared, but after the final drafts and everything went in for publication for the Divinitas article. So give me a chance and to engage with existential inertia a wee bit more.
Excellent. Good. Well, I think that's and again, we've had multiple conversations where we've gone into more detail on some of those other accounts as well. So people will just have to go through the backlog and find that. Gaven, before we go, what else do you want to announce? What's coming down the pipeline? What should people keep an eye out for?
So big conference in St. Patrick's Pontifical University next at the end of next April. Okay. 2022. We have a number of great speakers coming, huge international conference. Thomas Joseph White, Rudy Tay Veld, Francesca Aaron Murphy, John Nassis, Patrick Lee, Jula Klima, Cyril Reagan, David Bentley Hart, John Milbank, Rowan Williams. All these people are speaking, on the future of Christian thinking. You'll even have me giving a paper on it, philosophy, at the intersection. So please do, if you're interested in coming to Ireland, if you want to come over, we'll hang out, we'll have the crack, all the rest of it. Please do come over. It's going to be a great conference. There's a video up on our the conference landing page from our college website. Me interviewing Eleanor Stump just about the conference, what she's going to contribute to the conference. There'll be other videos going up as well of interviews of what these people are contributing to the conference. So please check out that landing page, for the conference, and please do consider coming to Ireland. Other than that, I'm just ticking away. I'm writing this book on Aquinas's classical theism. The philosophy behind that. Hence, all the engagement with all the different scholars in these issues. I'm knee deep in time and eternity at the minute, and I'm writing a book. With my esteemed colleague here, Pat, on the 5 ways. Coming out with Catholic answers. So that's taken over, and then I've just got a few wee articles up and running. So people have been asking me about agent causation and agent causality, and they know that I've been engaged with Anscombe, and I want to do a bit more sort of work on that. And other than that, we're just really getting into the autumn semester here in college. Sort of teaching is kicking off, and it's great. We're all back on campus again. So
good.
Yeah, so
good.
That's what I've been up to recently.
Excellent. Well, always busy, always productive. We love having you. So gentle listeners, please sure to be to like this, to share it. Your engagement helps a lot. So leave some questions if you have them, any comments, and also suggestions. Gavin's he's quite the philosophical generalist. So let us know what topics you'd like us to cover next time we bug him to come on. But Gaven, thank you so much, man. It's as always, it's my pleasure.
Not a problem. Thanks for having me.